working on it's Warhammer again, unfortunately, but I'm currently working on a massive Warhammer game called Darktide, which is about to ruin the world entirely, and another game that I'm, for NDA reasons, not allowed to tell you about. But my God, it's one of the biggest ones around. So,
Okay, so here's the thing. Where there's smoke, there's usually fire. And while I don't think anyone should rip their pants off yet and run down the street helicoptering their meat in glee, there is a mounting body of evidence to suggest that Total War Warhammer 40k might be moving into the pre-production stage soon-ish. I'll be the first to admit I'm biased on this topic. I legitimately really want it to happen. I've talked about it before. I think if done well, a combined trilogy of Total War 40k games has the potential to be the best-selling RTS series of all time, and would frankly blow even fantasy out of the water in terms of sales, simply by virtue of being a more popular setting. And so perhaps the hype beast in me does color my perspective on this a bit. But I also think I'm fairly analytical when it comes to topics like this, and I have a decent sense of how Creative Assembly likes to do business after working with them for so many years. Plus, I have a pretty good track record when it comes to speculation on future content, so take that for what it's worth. If that means nothing to you, then feel free to ignore what comes next. But as I said, where there's smoke, there is usually fire, and Dan Abnett, one of the most prolific 40k and fantasy writers in the Black Library, just dropped a massive hint that he's working on something, well, massive. He didn't explicitly say it's a 40k title, and he has done work for Marvel and DC and a handful of other studios, but first and foremost, he is known for his work in the Warhammer world, so keep that in mind. Now, Darktide is the next big 40k game on the horizon, and he's been hired as the main consultant and writer for that title. There's been a lot of hype swirling around it, which took a bit of a temporary hit when it was delayed into 2022, but as soon as news ramps back up on that and we start seeing gameplay, I think it's ultimately going to end up being huge. One of the most popular 40k titles ever, Space Marine, sold 1.2 million copies in the first couple months after launch. As an entire series, Dawn of War sold 7 million copies spread across 3 separate games. And Vermintide 2, developed by Fat Shark, the same studio creating Darktide, sold more than 2 million copies, set in the fantasy portion of the IP, which is nowhere near as popular as Warhammer 40,000. So basically, my point here is that Darktide should sell quite a bit more product than even the Vermintide series, as long as they don't fumble the bag with the marketing and gameplay reveals. And then we have Dan Abnett, closely tied to the Warhammer IP, coming out and saying he's working on a title that is significantly bigger than even Darktide. Then we take this letter from Anuj Mohatra, sorry if I butchered your name, my guy, my apologies, an employee who worked on Horus Heresy content for Forge World, but left last December to go join Creative Assembly. And then we take a basic surface level glance at the relationship between Games Workshop and CA, the latter of which just recently became the biggest developer in the UK, and the pieces are kind of falling into place, aren't they? I mean, we can ignore the evidence of our eyes and ears if we want to, and certainly this is not irrefutable proof of anything, but if you think about it logically, without emotion, it really does make a lot of sense. Relic Entertainment with Dawn of War 3 crashed and burned with an extremely successful RTS, leaving a void that if you're Games Workshop, you would certainly want filled. Then around that same time, Creative Assembly comes along and makes huge waves with the Total War Warhammer trilogy, a trilogy so successful they're creating new races alongside Games Workshop. A trilogy so successful, it has the potential to spawn a new genre of RTS, combining multiple titles into these massive, cohesive experiences that sell a hell of a lot of DLC. I personally know about half a dozen of them or so who own tabletop armies and were playing it before the pandemic, and purely from a financial perspective, I mean, the top level guys are jizzing at the opportunities here. Games Workshop is in love with the work that's going on and the money they're making, and so is CA, because the potential for expansions and DLC is far beyond what historical Total Wars have afforded in the past. Like, a Slavic DLC, or a Black Sea DLC, or a Desert Kingdoms DLC is cool and all, but those are far more limited and limiting than Genestealer Cults, or Blood Angels, or Thousand Suns. I mean, you could take literally just the major Space Marine chapters and just the major Traitor Legions, and you would already have more content and DLC on offer than any previous historical title. And you certainly have a huge fan base that would be willing to shell out some serious cash to get all those factions, units, and legendary lords fully fleshed out in a galaxy-spanning campaign. So, if you're the big dick suits at either company, and you have this incredibly lucrative synergy that has people clamoring for more, you would not be doing your job if you weren't actively thinking about how to make a Total War Warhammer 40k trilogy work, because it would lay the groundwork and future of your company for the next decade. That is the scope of what we're dealing with here, and the gigantic financial windfall that could come as a result. So yeah, I know a decent chunk of this community thinks this never has any chance of happening, that it's too far outside the established formula of Total War, and to those people, while I get what you're saying, I think you're looking at it with too myopic a lens. I think you're being short-sighted. I've tackled many of these criticisms head-on in the past, so if you'd like to hear an in-depth argumentation on why I think it could work, and what Creative Assembly would need to do to prepare for it, then feel free to dive into that series on my channel. But yeah, a Total War Warhammer 40k series doesn't need to have blocks of 160 Hormagaunts and Termagants running around in a perfect rectangle formation. It doesn't need to play exactly like Medieval 2 or even like Total War Warhammer in terms of how combat functions. Would it require some significant changes, implementing cover, squad combat, vehicles, urban warfare, and a focus on devastating ranged firepower? Absolutely. It would look different than current Total War games, there's not a question in my mind. But Total War, in a nutshell, is about large-scale, real-time battles with an overarching grand campaign map that gives those battles context. Plain and simple. The idea that changing elements of how combat functions, in terms of cover, or weaponry, or technology, that manipulating those would somehow prevent it from being a Total War game, is silly. Many of the current features we have in Warhammer 2 and Warhammer 3 would translate incredibly well, as would many of the assets. Demons and Greenskins being a prime example of content that's already been created that would make an appearance without massive changes. Bombardment spells works like artillery. Steam tanks work like vehicles. A lot of those features already make sense. Would they need to be changed? Yes. Could they make it in without crazy changes? Also, yes. If I can move my camera, just like any other Total War game, if I can control entire armies from on high, then zoom down into the action for those incredible cinematic affairs with hundreds or thousands of troops, if there's a replay system, if there's a campaign, if I can build an empire through conquest, diplomacy, and painting the galaxy my color, then it is still a Total War game. Having vehicles, elements of squad-based tactics, a real cover system, and futuristic weaponry does not change that in the slightest. So, if you ask me, do I think Total War Warhammer 40k is on Creative Assembly's agenda? Yes, I absolutely do, and with every rumor and tertiary source that leaks out, I become more and more convinced that that is true. When Dan Abnett says he's working on something even bigger than Darktide, and he is so well known for his work in the 40k universe, Total War is my first thought. Do I think it's going to come anytime soon? No, absolutely not. I think at best, they're in the pre-production phase, and we would maybe start hearing about it like 3 years from now, with release date in the mid-2020s. Could things fall through? Could it never see the light of day? Could it be an hour of wolves before the age of man comes crashing down and alien invasions carry off our livestock and probe our butts into the next dimension? Sure. Yeah, that could happen. It's hard to know how business will go. Games Workshop and CA could have a falling out over IP guidelines or whatever the hell at some point down the road. But as of right now, CA and Games Workshop would be crazy to not be seriously considering a 40k trilogy in the same vein as Total War Warhammer. And I don't think it's just a possibility, I think it is an eventuality. And I have no problem staking my claim on this hill and being strung up by the angry mobs if I am wrong. Good thing I'm not, though.